On a sunny afternoon in the summer of 1953, a young woman named An stood in the middle of a huge sugarcane grove in an isolated forest in Papua New Guinea. And around her were all her relatives and neighbors, and they were all there to mourn the loss of An's sister, whose name was Tan. She had passed away 3 days earlier from a very mysterious illness that people in An's village called kuru. And in their language, the word kuru meant trembling. Now, keep in mind, this particular mystery illness that was called kuru only affected the people in An and Tan's village. This is like a hyper-specific illness that only happened inside of this little forest to these people. But An and the rest of the people in her village had seen this happen over and over and over again every year, and so they knew what happened when you got kuru because it was always the same. As soon as you began to tremble, that was kind of like the first sign. 1 year or so after that moment, you lose control of all the muscles in your body until you die. And so in Tan's case, so An's sister, she had watched this happen exactly as it did for everybody else that ever got this illness. She started with the tremors, and then before long, she couldn't even stand up or walk around. And then finally, her sister lost control of the muscles in her throat. And so she couldn't eat despite being hungry. And so ultimately she died of starvation, which is like one of the worst ways to die. It's incredibly slow and very, very painful. And so ever since Tan's death 3 days earlier, the village had been performing all these rituals and prayers in an attempt to assist Tan's spirit on its way into the afterlife. And this type of very involved funeral was absolutely customary in An's culture. An and her family and all of these villagers were members of the Foray people, who were native to Papua New Guinea, which is an island just north of Australia. And in 1953, when this story is taking place, the Foray people numbered about 11,000 people. And remember, they live in a very isolated forest. They are basically cut off from the world for the most part. But they were beginning to fear that they were going to go extinct because of kuru. Every year, the Foray people lost 200 people to kuru. And for the most part, the victims were women, like disproportionately so, which made it even more likely that the Foray people would go extinct. Because if you lose all the women, you can't have any more kids. And in fact, by 1953, so many women had died from kuru that by this point, there were 3 times as many men as there were women. In fact, the leading cause of death for Foray women was kuru. But the Foray people did not view kuru as just an illness. They actually viewed it as a curse. In fact, that was completely accepted that that is exactly what it was. This is not like getting the cold. Somebody did this to you, like a sorcerer somewhere, some unnamed sorcerer that's like coming into the forest is targeting these women and cursing them with kuru. And so the Foray people put on these really elaborate funerals, mostly to ward off these dark magic sorcerers that were casting kuru spells. And so the Foray people believed that if they just nailed the funeral procedure for somebody who has just died from kuru, the kind of 3-day long, all these rituals and prayers they have to do, if the village is able to nail it perfectly, then the deceased who's passed away from kuru, so in this case, An's sister Tan, her spirit, as a result of this perfect funeral, would be able to kind of rise up and actually seek revenge on the sorcerer who killed the person. And so these funerals were basically like kind of taking the dead, rising their spirit, and sending them off to go kill the sorcerer. And so An and the rest of her villagers, they went through this very elaborate process for An's sister, Tan, and at the end of it, they did feel like they had really nailed it. And so they felt confident that Tan's spirit was going to rise up and get her revenge. A few weeks after An's sister's funeral, An was standing over an open fire and she was cooking some pork and sweet potatoes. And as she went to flip the meat over, she reached her hand out and she noticed her hand was trembling, which is the first sign of someone with kuru. Now, An told herself that, oh no, I don't have kuru. It's just because I was working really hard today and I'm tired, like that's all it is. But she knew deep down she may have been cursed. An did her best to kind of hide her trembling hands. However, after about a month from that first time she noticed her hand shaking, she noticed she wasn't really able to stand up without kind of losing her balance because her legs were starting to tremble. And finally, when she basically couldn't even stand up without assistance, this is again only 1 month after that first tremble, she knew she had kuru. And An already knew that there was absolutely nothing anybody in her village could do to stop this from killing her. Kuru was a 100% death sentence. And so if you got kuru, it's like the whole village just began prepping for your death because they had to be ready to do this big ritualistic funeral. And so imagine that. You have this mystery illness or curse or whatever you want to think it is, and you're just counting down the days until you die. But for An, even though she had seen this happen so many times before and just kind of knew there's nothing she could do, she couldn't stand the idea of having this horrible, slow, painful death. And so she decided, you know what? I'm gonna do something drastic that basically nobody else had done before who had Kuru. So for context, at this time, the Foray people had been totally isolated from other people in the world for thousands of years. They basically lived in this little part of Papua New Guinea in the forest, and nobody else contacted them. They were totally isolated. However, starting in the 1950s, some Australian colonists and researchers and police actually began kind of making their way in and around the Foray people's area. So they were making contact, albeit not necessarily direct contact, but the Foray people were seeing basically white people wandering around in and around their forest from time to time. And it was always very shocking when they would see these people because they dressed completely differently, they looked totally different. I mean, it's like two worlds totally colliding. And generally speaking, An and the rest of the people in her village, they did not like having these Australian people kind of wandering around. But An is thinking, you know, the people in my village, the Foray people, they have no solutions for me. So maybe these Australian people that have kind of popped up, maybe they have some answers about what I can do to stop myself from dying from this horrible curse. Keep in mind, by going out and seeking help from these outsiders, it was like An would be breaking a huge custom. This is so taboo for the Foray people, and very likely, even if she was able to find a solution from these outsiders, it's not clear if she would have been welcomed back into her village. And so this is a truly desperate measure she's taking. But she really felt like she had no choice. So, even as her body trembled from Kuru, An managed to stand up using a stick, and she began kind of hobbling her way quietly and discreetly out of her village, something that she really never did. And eventually, after hobbling her way out of sight of the Foray people, she began making her way through the woods, and she eventually came to a clearing where there was this house. And it was obvious this is not a house that the Foray people have built. This is somebody from the outside who's built something kind of near where they were living. And so An wandered up to this house, not really sure what to do, but she went up and knocked on the door, and a second later it opened up. And it's this Australian anthropologist named Ronald Burnt, who actually An had seen before. He had been coming through her village a couple of times, attempting to interview people to learn more about the Foray people. She knew that nobody wanted to talk to him, but, you know, she had seen him before. And so she was relieved. This is someone that I'm somewhat familiar with. And so as Ronald is staring back at her, and Ronald's pretty tall and skinny, he's got glasses on, he's dressed like a typical Australian in the 1950s, and he's looking at An, and An begins to try to tell him what's going on with her. And as she began to talk, the words she was saying were coming out all garbled, and she realized that the Kuru curse was now affecting her throat, the muscles in her neck, and she was not able to speak. But as it happened, Ronald, who was very familiar with the Foray people, he could tell, based on just the way she was acting and how desperate she looked, that very likely this woman was here because she believed she had Kuru. And Ronald, who had learned about Kuru after studying the Foray people, he had done some research on it, and he believed it was entirely psychosomatic, that this was not an actual illness. Basically, he believed Kuru was acute hysteria, that these Foray people were just going crazy and convincing themselves that they had this illness, and I guess that kind of manifested their death a year later. And so Ronald interrupted An, who again is struggling to talk, and he was able to communicate to her in her language that you do not have Kuru, you are hysterical, this is in your head, and you should go now. And then he shut the door on her. And An had no idea what to do. She was embarrassed. She was terrified that maybe somebody from her village had seen her come out here. And so just trembling and feeling so alone and so scared, she turned around and just went back to her village. 9 months later, An's condition had severely deteriorated. She basically was following exactly the process of every other person she had seen with Kuru. She had lost virtually all the control of her body. She could barely sip water. She was feeling absolutely horrible. I mean, she knew she was closing in on death. And she had not gone back out to try to get help from outsiders. That interaction with Ronald had kind of destroyed her hope. And so she did go back and just was kind of waiting to die, just like everybody else in her village did. But for An, the physical symptoms of Kuru that she was experiencing were undoubtedly terrible. but they were not as bad, at least to An, as the other side of Kuru. So in addition to referring to this curse as Kuru, which meant trembling, sometimes Foray people would refer to this curse, this illness, as the laughing death. And it's because during the terminal stage, so the end stage of Kuru, when you're just about to die, you just begin laughing. It doesn't matter what you're thinking about. This is not an actual laugh. You're not thinking something's funny. It's like you could be weeping and totally depressed because you know you're gonna die, but you keep hysterically laughing, which makes your whole body sore from constantly laughing over and over again. And An was beginning to experience that. She would be weeping and laughing at the same time. And think about this, everybody else who's in the village, they know what this means. And so their preparations for her death are only getting more and more ramped up. They're getting ready for the big ritualistic funeral they're going to give to An. And so An, as she's hysterically laughing, is fully aware that everybody's just waiting for her to die. And finally, just a few weeks after she had begun the laughing side of Kuru, An would pass away, almost exactly 1 year from when she first noticed the trembling in her hand when she was cooking over that fire. If you don't know this, late last year, we launched a brand new, strange, dark, and mysterious show called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. And so far, people love it. It is a free weekly show where each week we explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape: our own bodies. Topics discussed on the show range from obscure diseases and freak occurrences to totally weird medical mishaps that sometimes result in big, amazing discoveries and other times result in just unimaginable suffering and death. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you really ought to give MrBallen's Medical Mysteries a try. To start listening, go look up and follow MrBallen's Medical Mysteries on any podcast platform, and boom, you're in. You got yourself a new weekly show. But if you're super impatient, like I am, and you can't wait a whole week to get a new episode, well, with your Prime membership, you can listen to an entire batch of 8 episodes at once, because we release them 8 at a time on Amazon Music. Also, on Amazon Music, there are no ads. And if all this was not enough to sell you on maybe giving the show a try, well, then stick around at the end of this video, and I'll play you a sneak peek from our newest episode of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. After An's death, more and more people just kept on getting Kuru. And over the next 7 years, it was like clockwork. 200 plus Foray people died from Kuru every year, and nobody had any idea how to stop it. It just became a part of their lives. And again, they kept getting closer and closer to being extinct. It was this really terrifying time. 7 years after An's death, so in 1961, a medical anthropologist named Shirley Lindenbaum was sitting in her office at City University in New York reading over old scientific articles. And as she was just kind of flipping through them, she noticed there was an article from an Australian anthropologist named Ronald Berndt, the same guy who had turned An away and told her, no, you don't have Kuru, that's not real, it's psychosomatic. And in this article, Ronald outlined these symptoms that the Foray people were exhibiting that obviously were not real. They had tremors, loss of muscle control, and huge mood swings. But Ronald was like, it's all in their head. It's not a real disease. But to Shirley, as she's reading this, she's thinking, why has Ronald decided this has to be psychosomatic? These symptoms seem like a real disease, like a neurological condition. Something must be attacking their brains, causing them to have these symptoms and then die. But when Shirley, just out of curiosity, began to do some additional research on the Kuru disease, or whatever you want to call it, she discovered that there was basically no real research other than Ronald's about this weird illness. And so she decided, you know what, there's a gap in the research, and I'm going to fill it. I'm going to figure out what's going on with the Foray people and this weird thing called Kuru. So the following summer, when Shirley finally had some time, she left New York and flew to Papua New Guinea, and she made her way into the forests to contact the Foray people. And eventually she reached some of these small villages that contained Foray people, and the Foray people, even if they didn't necessarily embrace Shirley, many of them were open to at least speaking to her and talking about their culture, their customs, their history, and of course, talking about Kuru, this curse. And eventually, Shirley made her way into this one particular 4A village where she actually saw a white man just walking around in this village. So he really stood out. And so immediately, Shirley walked up to this guy and he introduced himself as Dr. Michael Alpers. And he told Shirley he had been living in these villages with the 4A people for several months because he was studying Kuru. He wanted to figure out, what's actually causing it, because he also felt very skeptical at the idea that this is just psychosomatic. That did not seem very plausible. And so Shirley and Dr. Alpers were totally aligned, and they're like, hey, let's swap notes and do this together. And so Shirley began telling Dr. Alpers about what she had learned so far, and she said that when she showed up in Papua New Guinea, she believed what Kuru was a genetic brain disease, meaning it would be passed down from, parent to child and so on and so forth. But she quickly discovered that after conducting research and talking to the 4A people in these villages, that was not the case. This was not something that went from parent to child. Instead, Kuru appeared to spread amongst tight-knit social groups within these villages, which seemed to indicate this was actually a contagious disease, not a genetic one. And so she told Dr. Alpers that now her working theory was that Kuru was actually a contagious type of encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain. But Shirley also said to Dr. Alpers that did not explain why so many victims of Kuru were female. And Shirley also said to Dr. Alpers that, I've been around loads of people with Kuru and I don't have it, so how can it be contagious? Dr. Alpers agreed with everything Shirley was saying, and in fact had come to a similar conclusion himself, which meant he also had the same questions. Why only women, and why wasn't he getting it? But he told Shirley that when he began trying to answer this question, he discovered that actually, in addition to lots of women getting Kuru, also lots of kids got Kuru. Not necessarily parent to child, but also children in these villages seemed to be slightly more susceptible to getting Kuru than men. And in fact, Dr. Alpers told Shirley that right now there was a 12-year-old boy who was in the final stage of Kuru, so the laughing stage, the terminal stage, and because this boy's parents knew their son was going to die, they were so desperate and grief-stricken that when Dr. Alpers came by and offered to do an autopsy on their son when he passed to try to learn more, the parents agreed, even though that meant totally breaking 4A custom. So this was like major taboo decision. But again, the 4A people are getting more and more desperate as they go closer and closer to the brink of extinction from Kuru. A few days later, Dr. Alpers found Shirley, and he told her that the 12-year-old boy had passed away, and so now it was time to conduct the autopsy. And so he led Shirley to a clearing in the woods that was kind of far away from the eyes of the villagers, and there was a makeshift autopsy table with this boy's body on it. And while Shirley really could not stand to watch this actually happen, she did go over after Dr. Alpers had opened up the boy's skull, revealing his brain. And he yelled to her, "Hey, you have to come over here and look at this." And so Shirley walked over and she looked down, and even though she had not seen a human brain before right in front of her, she knew right away there's something terribly wrong with that brain. His brain was completely shriveled up and covered in holes, as if like a worm had drilled through his brain. And so Shirley and Dr. Alpers immediately knew this brain has to be sent off for further testing because something's happening here that's not psychosomatic. This is a real disease that is killing these people. About a year later, Shirley was back home in New York in her office when she received a letter from a research team at the United States National Institutes of Health, or NIH for short. And the NIH is one of the largest medical research facilities in the world. And it was where Shirley and Dr. Alpers had sent off that boy's brain for further study. And so by getting this letter, Shirley knew she was going to get information about whatever they discovered in this boy's brain. And so she ripped it open and pulled out the report and began reading. And the researchers said they had spent the last year, studying this brain tissue. And while they still didn't really understand how Kuru even happened and what caused it, was it a virus or an infection? They didn't know, but they had discovered something about how Kuru spread. During one of their experiments, the NIH researchers had injected some tissue from this boy's brain into a chimpanzee, and very quickly, that chimpanzee developed Kuru. And so this told the researchers that yes, Kuru was contagious, and it spread through infected brain tissue. But how one person's infected brain got into another person's brain was the big mystery. But at least they had found something. But as Shirley read this, Because she had done all that research when she went into the forests of Papua New Guinea and spoke to all these 4A people, she had learned a lot about what they did on a day-to-day basis and, what their various customs and rituals were. And she actually knew exactly how something like this could happen, something that only the 4A people were doing. During her research in Papua New Guinea, Shirley had learned that 4A people believe all humans have 5 distinct souls. There was that one soul that 4A people believed they could basically summon up out of a deceased person that would then go avenge that person's death. So think about how all those people who died from Kuru, they believed that was a curse from some sorcerer. And so a big part of that funeral process was to call out that soul to go avenge their death, go find the sorcerer and kill them. But that was just one soul. There were 4 others. And of these 4 others, there was one called the Quila, which was the most dangerous. Quila meant flesh in the 4A people's language, and this soul was like a manifestation of death and decay, because that's what our flesh does. It just kind of gradually dies all the time. And so they looked at the flesh as being a really bad thing. And so they believed after someone died, their flesh needed to be stored properly. Otherwise, it would pollute the air and cause more death and decay for other people that were still alive. And the safest place, according to the 4A people, for the Quila to be stored, so human flesh, was inside of a woman's body. And the reason for this is 4A people believe women's bodies are much more resilient than men's. And so if anybody could withstand holding Quila inside of them, it would be the women. But there was a very specific process that the 4A women had to follow in order to kind of put this Quila inside of themselves. And multiple 4A women had explained this totally bizarre process to Shirley when she was out there talking to the people in the village. The way it worked is a few days after a 4A member has passed away, this huge feast is prepared. Except the feast only consists of the Quila. Basically, the person who is dead is chopped up and prepared by the women, like their entire body gets consumed. Now, keep in mind, anybody hearing about this who's not a member of the 4A people would be like, oh my God, that's horrible. But to 4A people, this ritualistic cannibalism was actually an act of love. The idea was by having these women consume the Quila, consuming the dead person, you're protecting the living because you don't want the Quila out and about polluting the air, and you are respecting the dead. But remember, Kuru got spread through infected brain tissue. And it just so happened that during these funeral feasts, when they were consuming the Quila, the brain of the deceased person was an absolute delicacy. And so the brain was reserved for close female relatives of the deceased person. And so during An's sister's funeral, so when Ton passed, what do you think An ate? She ate Ton's brain. And then also, critically, Shirley had learned that a lot of these women who were given the brain, this delicacy during these funerals, they would often sneak little pieces of the brain and hand it out to kids as like a little treat. They would take the brain and eat it. Nobody knew. That's why the kids were also getting Kuru. And so a few years after this incredible discovery by Shirley about how Kuru was being passed along, the Australian colonial government banned the practice of ritualistic cannibalism in Papua New Guinea. Basically, they were telling the 4A people to stop eating the dead. It's what's killing you. And the 4A people, who were very desperate to stop being killed by Kuru, they took to it, stopped eating each other, and so Kuru was virtually eradicated, and the 4A population, instead of sliding towards extinction, actually began to grow really fast. And today, the total population has at least doubled. And also, just to close this out, one final note is it took until 1990 to actually figure out what was going on inside of these people's bodies when they had Kuru. Because back in the 60s, when they figured out how not to get Kuru, nobody understood what was even happening. It was just like, don't eat other people and you'll be okay, but that's all they knew. And while the process in the human body that caused Kuru remained a mystery for many decades after Shirley's big discovery, in the 1990s, researchers did finally figure out what's actually going on. Basically, somebody with Kuru has these proteins in their brain called prions that fold wrong into the wrong shape and then cannot function properly. This loss of protein function rapidly kills brain cells, which in turn shrivels up the brain and causes all those holes all over it. 18-year-old Aaron Blocker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It was January 2011, and the Mississippi College freshman was doing his best to pay attention in his chemistry class. Chemistry was usually Aaron's favorite class. He dreamed of being a scientist himself. But today, he was distracted. His stomach was cramping, and he really had to go to the bathroom. Aaron had Crohn's disease, an illness that causes stomach cramps, severe weight loss, and diarrhea. He'd been diagnosed the year before, but for the past few weeks, he'd been suffering from a prolonged flare-up. Already this morning, Aaron had left the lecture hall 3 times to go to the restroom. Aaron tried to ignore all the twisting and churning that was going on in his stomach and just listen to the lecture, but pretty soon Aaron realized he couldn't ignore it any longer. So, like he already had 3 other times so far this morning, he quietly got up and began heading for the door again. But as Aaron climbed the stairs that led out of the lecture hall, he tripped over a backpack and nearly fell. Now, immediately, Aaron heard people laughing at him in the classroom, but that didn't really bother him, because all Aaron was thinking is, thank goodness that was not worse. Aaron had always been a bit uncoordinated, and he did fall kind of a lot, and unfortunately, he was very prone to breaking bones from even the mildest of impacts. As a child, he had managed to break his nose, his fingers, and his wrist, and he had also dislocated several joints. Thankfully though, on this day, Aaron did reach the doors of the lecture hall in one piece, and then once Aaron was out the doors, he hustled his way down the hall towards the bathroom. 2 nights later, Aaron sat in the college cafeteria across from his girlfriend, Emily, who he had been dating for nearly a year. Aaron was a grade ahead of Emily, so she was actually still in high school. She was a senior. But his college was not far from her home, and so she came to visit him whenever she could. Emily had just gotten her first tattoo, and she was telling Aaron all about the experience, but Aaron was having a really hard time focusing on her story. The distinctive sort of greasy aroma of sloppy joes and tater tots filled the busy dining hall, and it was making Aaron feel really nauseous. He was on a restrictive diet because of his Crohn's disease, and the cafeteria's very greasy food was brutal on his stomach. But his dorm didn't have a kitchen, so he really had no other choice but to try to eat as much as he could handle. As he tried to force down some food, his stomach suddenly spasmed and Aaron clutched his belly in pain. Emily saw this and stopped her story and asked if he was okay, but Aaron sort of brushed it off. He said he was used to the pain and told her not to worry. But this time, the pain was just too much, and Aaron doubled over in agony as another spasm cut through his gut. Emily shot up from her chair and put her arm around him, and then whispered to him that he really needed to go see a doctor. And Aaron nodded and told her that, his abdominal pains had been getting worse and worse for days. And so Emily gathered up all their things and then called a taxi to take them to the nearest hospital. A couple of hours later, Aaron laid in a hospital bed in the emergency room with Emily sitting by his side. The doctor had ordered an immediate CT scan of Aaron's abdomen, and so now they were just waiting for the results. Aaron clutched Emily's hand and let out a deep breath. He was, unfortunately, quite used to hospitals, doctors, needles, and machines. And in virtue of being Aaron's girlfriend, Emily, too, was very accustomed to this environment. Aaron was very grateful to have his girlfriend by his side. And so he looked up at Emily, and he told her he just could not imagine going through all this stuff by himself. But before she could reply, the ER doctor came into the room with Aaron's test results. And the doctor got straight to the point and said he'd found something very troubling in Aaron's CT scan. But it was actually not Aaron's gut that was concerning the doctor. He said during the CT scan, as they're trying to photograph his abdomen, the scan had kind of inadvertently caught a bit of Aaron's hip bones. And basically, the bones showed signs that they were dying. It's a condition called avascular necrosis, which happens when blood supply to a bone is cut off, and so the tissue decays. Aaron closed his eyes and grimaced. He wondered if maybe this condition he'd never even heard of might explain his history of so many broken bones. Aaron quickly filled the doctor in about his medical history, and how doctors had really struggled to figure out why his bones always seemed so brittle. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, Aaron had been tested for various conditions, from common issues like arthritis to a rare genetic condition called Wilson's disease. But each time, the results were either negative or inconclusive. It wasn't until Aaron was diagnosed with Crohn's disease a year ago that Aaron finally got an answer that sort of made sense. His doctor had told him that because his Crohn's disease had been untreated for so long, Aaron had been malnourished, and as a result, his bones were weakened. But that was a year ago, and since then, Aaron had done everything in his power to eat right and build up his strength, and so it just seemed like, he would have been doing better by now. The ER doctor listened closely and took a bunch of notes. Then, after Aaron was done speaking, the doctor asked him if he was taking any new medications. And Aaron nodded and said that yes, for the past 8 weeks, he'd been taking low doses of a steroid called prednisone to help reduce the inflammation caused by Crohn's disease. Aaron could see from the ER doctor's expression that he was puzzled. The doctor said that steroids could cause bone damage like this, but only with prolonged use and high doses. In his opinion, 8 weeks was just not enough time to cause this much damage to Aaron's hips. But just to be safe, the ER doctor recommended that Aaron go see the other doctor who'd prescribed him this steroid to see if maybe they could change his treatment plan. Aaron's mind was swirling. He had convinced himself that if he could just get his Crohn's disease under control, he could live a normal college student life. But now here he was being told he had an even bigger problem with no clear solution. And so Aaron shook his head in disbelief. But at the same time, he tried to stay positive. He hoped that if he stopped taking steroids, his bones would stop breaking down and he would get better. 2 years later, on a muggy summer day, Aaron clutched the sticky vinyl seat of a campus shuttle bus. Every time the bus hit even the smallest of bumps, Aaron would feel pain shooting through his hips. Aaron was now 20 years old and working hard towards his degree in biology and medical sciences. It was fascinating to him to learn how the human body worked. He hoped that someday he'd know enough to understand what was happening to him. Because Aaron was still in constant pain. His weakened hips made it really hard for him to walk around campus, so he took the shuttle bus as often as he could, even though it was quite painful. Right after visiting the emergency room 2 years earlier, Aaron had stopped taking steroids, but that hadn't helped, and his hips had only gotten worse. At this rate, Aaron knew he could be facing a hip replacement surgery before he even turned 30 years old. When the shuttle bus came to a stop, Aaron carefully climbed down the steps and limped into the lobby of the school's medical building for an appointment with his orthopedist. He sighed as he shuffled his way into the very familiar waiting room. Doctors and nurses in hospitals were now as much a part of Aaron's life as college professors. A few minutes later, Aaron hobbled into an exam room and climbed up onto the crisp white paper covering the examination table. When the doctor arrived, he asked Aaron to lie down, but Aaron was in so much pain, the doctor had to actually help him lie down. After poking and prodding Aaron and also guiding Aaron's legs through several movements to check his range of motion, the doctor stepped back and grabbed Aaron's latest scans and began looking them over. And as he did, Aaron could tell he was very likely about to hear some bad news. He had seen that same concerned look on many doctors' faces in the past. Finally, the orthopedist lowered the paperwork and told Aaron that his avascular necrosis in his hip bones had continued to worsen and it was leaving behind a lot of dead bone tissue. And so he wanted Aaron to consider a surgery called core decompression to remove the diseased bone in Aaron's hips. Once the dead bone was gone, new blood vessels could develop and healthy bone could grow back. Ideally, this procedure would reduce Aaron's pain and help him avoid total hip replacement surgery down the road. Aaron was so desperate to feel better that he only had one question. How soon could they schedule this surgery? 8 weeks later, Aaron was at home in his small off-campus apartment, studying in bed. He hadn't been able to move much since his surgery, and he was irritable at how slow his recovery had been. He was having trouble focusing on the biology textbook he was reading, so he put it down and reached for the TV remote. But when he clicked the power button, the TV wouldn't turn on. Aaron wondered if maybe the remote's batteries were dead, so he carefully swung his legs over the side of the bed, grabbed onto his headboard, and pulled himself upright. Then Aaron grabbed the aluminum walker right next to his bed that he needed just to get around, and he inched his way across the room to his desk. He pulled 2 AA batteries out of the desk, but then he dropped one of the batteries as well as the back of the TV remote onto the floor. And Aaron suddenly thought to himself, what is he going to do? Getting down on the floor on his hands and knees was just totally out of the question. It would not only be very painful, but he also might not be able to stand up again. And so Aaron just suddenly felt overwhelmed by how much pain he was in, how inconvenient his life now was, and also just the fact that 2 months after surgery, it just did not feel like he was getting any better. But just then, Aaron heard the key in the front door, and a moment later, his girlfriend Emily called out his name. Aaron was so relieved that she was there. He yelled that he was in his bedroom and he could really use some help. Emily came into the room, and she could see that Aaron was very distraught. She helped him back into his bed and then reached under the dresser to retrieve the battery and the back of the remote. Emily suggested that Aaron just close his eyes for a half hour and she'd make him some lunch. Aaron smiled and felt so thankful to have Emily in his life, and then he did close his eyes. But Aaron was too anxious about his situation to fall asleep. It felt like his life's goals were slipping away from him. Aaron had to take time off of school after the surgery, and he didn't want to delay getting his degree any longer. And so he really just had to find a way to get better soon, or else the future that he longed for with Emily just wouldn't be able to exist. One month later, a nurse at the orthopedist's office led Aaron into an exam room and closed the door behind them. Aaron attempted to climb the tiny step stool in front of the examination table like he had done so many times in the past, but this time the pain in his hips was so extreme he just couldn't do it, so he opted for a chair instead. A minute later, Aaron heard a soft knock on the door and his orthopedist came in. The doctor pulled up a stool in front of the room's computer monitor so they could look at the results of Aaron's latest CT scans. Once the doctor had pulled up the images, he pointed to the balls in both of Aaron's hip sockets, and then he pulled up another image of a healthy hip joint to compare. The doctor said that on the healthy hip, the ball and socket looked like a smooth round sphere surrounded by space. But on Aaron's hips, the balls looked broken down and fractured. The joints were surrounded by white shadows that represented scar tissue that had grown and grown over the years. This was obviously not what the doctor or Aaron had hoped for. The bones in his hips were grinding together and continuing to break down, which meant the core decompression surgery was a failure. Aaron asked the doctor why his bones kept decaying no matter what doctors recommended, and the doctor admitted he simply didn't know. The doctor said the next step would be a double hip replacement surgery. But he assured Aaron that although it was unusual to replace hips in someone so young as Aaron, it was a common surgery with great results. And so he told Aaron that after his surgery, he would very likely be able to walk easily again and his pain would be gone. But despite that, this was still a very difficult decision for Aaron. If he went through with the hip replacement surgery, he would need up to a year of recovery and rehab, which would mean putting his schoolwork on hold again when he was so looking forward to graduation and doing scientific or biomedical research in the real world. And so this was going to be a really challenging decision. But then Aaron stood up to go get his jacket, and his hips hurt so much just walking the 3 feet to the coat hanger, Aaron realized he really had no choice here. The pain was so bad and it was only getting worse, and so he basically had to do the hip replacement surgery. 4 years later, in 2016, the clock radio on Aaron's nightstand belted out a pop song, jolting him awake. Aaron rolled over and hit the snooze button, and as he did, he smiled. Before his hip replacement 4 years ago, rolling over would have been so painful, but now he was moving just fine. It had taken a long time to become this healthy again. Following the hip replacement surgery, Aaron had to stop going in person to school and take online classes in order to finish his degree on time. He spent his time mostly indoors and bedridden, but slowly he had regained his mobility and had gotten his life back on track. Aaron had graduated from college and was now pursuing a master's degree in biomedical research at Mississippi College. At the age of 24, 4 years after the surgeries, Aaron was finally focusing on his future rather than his pain. Through it all, Emily had stayed by his side, like always. And at the end of 2012, Aaron asked her to marry him, and to his delight, she had said yes. They were married on August 1st, 2013, the best day of Aaron's life. Aaron could hear Emily in the kitchen cooking up some breakfast. A moment later, she called to him and asked if he wanted some eggs. Aaron yelled back that he'd be right there as he put his slippers on. Just then, Aaron's alarm clock went off again, and without thinking, Aaron twisted around to stop it. And as he did, he suddenly felt an excruciating pain in his left hip. The worst pain he had ever felt in his entire life. Aaron instantly writhed in pain and fell back on the bed and shouted for Emily. She rushed into the bedroom and tried to help Aaron stand, but he couldn't move his left leg at all because the pain was now totally unbearable. And so through gritted teeth, he asked Emily to hand him his phone, and when she did, Aaron called a friend, and a few minutes later, that friend arrived, and together with Emily, they helped lift Aaron up and carried him out to the car so they could drive him to the hospital. An hour later, Aaron lay on a gurney staring up at the hospital ceiling lights flashing past him as the ER staff whisked him down a hospital corridor to the CT scan room. Aaron had hoped that these emergency visits were behind him, but here he was again amidst the smell of disinfectant, the high-pitched sounds of equipment, and very sick people just like him. In the scan room, technicians helped move Aaron's aching body to the motorized table, making Aaron groan every time they touched him. As the table began to move, Aaron could hear buzzing and whirring noises as the machinery took images of his hips and midsection. Even lying there was painful, because Aaron had to clench his muscles to keep his legs perfectly still. Once the scan was over, Aaron clenched his teeth in pain as the technicians shifted him back onto the gurney and then wheeled him back to a waiting room. And after an agonizing hour of waiting, a doctor finally came in the room to go over the results. As the ER doctor pulled up Aaron's files on the room's computer, Aaron filled him in on his history with Crohn's disease, a vascular necrosis, and hip replacements. Aaron was so accustomed to recounting his medical history that it now came out like a well-rehearsed presentation. The doctor turned the computer monitor towards Aaron and told him that based on the scan, his hip implant had popped out of the socket and shifted into the wrong place. So the dislocated hip would have to be adjusted manually, a procedure the doctor warned would hurt, but only for a moment. The doctor asked Aaron if he was ready for the adjustment, and Aaron just sort of nodded and said okay. Then a second doctor came in to help with the procedure. Together, these doctors all around the bed forcefully pushed Aaron's hip back into place. And true to their word, it was a split second of agonizing pain. But it quickly dissipated, and Aaron felt much better. He asked the doctor what was next, and he got a familiar answer. Go back to your orthopedic surgeon for a follow-up. Several days later, Aaron sat inside the usual exam room at his orthopedist's office. The doctor examined Aaron's CT scans in silence for a minute, and then finally he spoke, and Aaron felt his heart sink. The doctor said that even though they had successfully popped the hip back into place, that didn't solve the underlying problem. Aaron's left hip implant had become loose because the bone around it was still decaying, and it was now only a matter of time until the same thing happened with his other leg. As a result, his hip implants were now too small to properly fit inside of their sockets. Aaron was shocked. How could this have happened? He'd followed all his doctor's instructions for years throughout his multiple recoveries and rehabs. He was very careful with his hips and he stayed away from really strenuous activities. And yet, he'd still dislocated his hip just from getting out of bed. It felt like all the progress he'd made was kind of for nothing. Aaron wondered what he could even do at this point to ease his pain. The orthopedic surgeon told Aaron that he couldn't really explain why Aaron's hips were in such bad shape, but he could tell him what should be done to respond. The only remedy he could suggest for now was to remove the damaged old implants and replace them again with larger ones. Aaron left the doctor's office in silence and headed for the parking lot. Then, alone, inside of his car, Aaron burst into tears. He just didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this. By the time Aaron got home, his despair had morphed into anger. He had already endured 11 serious surgeries and more broken bones than he could count, and he was only 24 years old. He'd seen a parade of doctors, and none of them had come remotely close to figuring out what was actually wrong with him. Even if he got another hip replacement, Aaron knew it was only a matter of time until he would have to do it again and again and again if his bones continued to decay. Aaron wondered if maybe he would just spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Just then, Emily got home from work, and when Aaron saw her, he went from being mad back to being sad all over again, and he broke down and just started crying. Emily tried to comfort him, but Aaron was inconsolable. So Emily just kind of let Aaron vent, and then once he was done crying and kind of talking about what was going on, she asked him to come keep her company in the kitchen while she made them dinner. Aaron smiled at her and then slowly eased himself into a chair at the kitchen table while Emily poured them each some wine. A few minutes later, Aaron had calmed down and he was thinking clearly, and he told Emily that too many elements of his medical story just didn't add up. Why would his hip implants fail after 4 years when they were supposed to last 20 years? Why didn't any of the other surgeries work? What was actually going on with his bones? If he was going to subject himself to yet another hip surgery, Aaron wanted to make sure he'd exhausted all other options first. But at this point, Aaron didn't trust any doctor to figure it out for him. So if he was going to find a solution, he felt like he would need to do it himself. Several weeks later, Aaron sat in bed with his laptop resting on his lap. Next to him, Emily was quietly reading a book. Aaron had compiled just about all of his medical records dating back to when he was a child, and finally, thanks to his years of studies, he could actually understand what they all meant. When he looked at all of his records together, Aaron found patterns that did make sense for a person suffering from Crohn's disease. But so far, nothing he was seeing could explain his weakened bones. Then, all of a sudden, Aaron sat up straight with a huge smile on his face. Emily noticed and put her book down and asked what was going on. And he showed her a series of his medical records going back a decade, all indicating severely low levels of an enzyme he'd only heard of once before, called alkaline phosphatase. Back in 2010, when Aaron was a junior in high school, one of his doctors had noticed he had low levels of this enzyme, which was why Aaron had been tested for the genetic condition called Wilson's disease. Now, Aaron did not think much of this at the time, since the results were inconclusive, and no one had ever mentioned the enzyme again. But as Aaron dove deeper into his medical records, he noticed the low levels of the enzyme in 2011 as well, and 2012, and 2013. In fact, every year since 2010, his blood tests indicated low levels of alkaline phosphatase. Emily and Aaron looked at each other. What was this enzyme, and what did having low levels of it mean? They wondered if maybe it was the key to understanding what was going wrong with Aaron's body. Emily looked on hopefully as Aaron typed in, "What is alkaline phosphatase?" into an online search engine. The first result he got back was for a website dedicated to an ultra-rare disease with a long name Aaron had never heard of. Aaron clicked on it, and then immediately after reading just a couple of sentences, he looked at Emily with a big smile on his face. All of his symptoms matched up with what he was reading. Aaron had no doubt he had just found what he was looking for. A week later, Aaron sat across from his doctor, studying his face as the physician read over the printed out pages Aaron had brought for him. The doctor was unfamiliar with this very rare disease that Aaron had found online, but he agreed that it did make a lot of sense, and it could be directly caused by the low levels of alkaline phosphatase in his blood. Aaron suspected he had a condition called hypophosphatasia. It's an ultra-rare metabolic bone disease that affects the body's ability to make alkaline phosphatase, which helps bones stay healthy by absorbing essential minerals like calcium, phosphate, and magnesium. When there's a deficiency in alkaline phosphatase, the minerals don't get absorbed by the bone. Instead, these minerals collect on tendons, kidneys, and other organs and cause serious damage. In Aaron's case, they had collected on his hip bones. Aaron's doctor ordered immediate bone scans to test for hypophosphatasia, and a few days later, the bone scans confirmed Aaron's theory was right. Miraculously, Aaron solved his own lifelong health crisis. In 2018, 1 year after his successful diagnosis, Aaron started on enzyme replacement therapy, which is the only treatment known for hypophosphatasia. Aaron also had 9 more surgeries to undo damage that had already been done to his body. But since starting the enzyme replacement treatments, Aaron's bones have stopped decaying, and calcium deposits in other parts of his body have disappeared completely. As for his Crohn's disease, which actually had nothing to do with his bone condition, that is in remission. But to this day, Aaron still does deal with small levels of pain every single day. Aaron successfully finished his master's degree and started a family with his wife. Currently, he works as a data and analytics consultant for a hospital system, and is a prominent patient advocate for hypophosphatasia.
My heart is turned, but time's not kind. Truth got burned, left me confined. I lied to you, fell apart. Now I'm lost in a broken heart.
In 2009, the Jameson family, which was Bobby, who was 44, Sherilyn, who was 40, and their daughter Madison, who was 6 years old, were living in Eufaula, Oklahoma on lakefront property. While they seemed to be living a simple and happy life, behind the scenes, their life was in turmoil. Bobby suffered from bad chronic back pain that he had as a result of a car accident that he was in 2003. Sherilyn was bipolar. She was medicated for it, but she didn't always take her meds, causing her to lash out at her family members, and it caused bouts of severe depression. Bobby and Sherilyn also believed that their house was haunted by 3 or 4 spirits who lived on their roof. Bobby was so convinced of this that he went to his pastor and asked where he could buy special bullets that he could shoot at these spirits. So for all of these reasons, the Jameson family was actually looking to leave their property in Eufaula and move somewhere else and hopefully start all over again, fresh, with a new shot at happiness. After the Jamesons would vanish, their family and friends would say, "We had no idea any of this was happening. We had no idea they were even considering a move." Now, this move they were considering was not a typical move. They were not looking to move into another house. They were looking to move onto a piece of property where they could place their storage container and live in the storage container until at some point they were going to build a house on a mountain and then move into the house. And they had actually already found a plot of land about 30 miles away from where they were currently living in a town called Red Oak. Now, the storage container itself that they planned on living in was actually sitting on their property in Eufaula. And it drew a lot of attention from the neighbors because Sherilyn would graffiti on it, "The neighbors have poisoned our cats. Witches don't like it when you kill their cats," because it turns out Sherilyn believed that she was a witch. So unsurprisingly, the neighbors avoided the Jameson family at all cost. Several weeks before the Jameson family went missing, they actually brought in a male boarder. So a guy that was going to live with them and help with manual labor in exchange for room and board. The boarder was a white supremacist that immediately took exception to Sherilyn, who was part Native American. And so anytime Bobby was out of the house, the white supremacist boarder would get into a fight with Sherilyn. And one day it came to a head and Sherilyn drew a gun on the boarder and said to leave the property or she was going to shoot him. The boarder refused to leave, and so Sherilyn began firing shots into the ground at his feet until he left. Now, once the Jameson family disappeared, this white supremacist boarder became one of the primary suspects. But when the FBI found him, he had a rock-solid alibi and was quickly crossed off the list of potential suspects. On October 8th, 2009, Bobby, Sherilyn, their daughter Madison, and their dog Maisie load up the truck and they start driving towards Red Oak. They were apparently going to go scout out this piece of property that they wanted to purchase to live on with the storage container. Now, according to family and friends, it was not uncommon for the Jamesons to vanish for several days at a time without telling anybody where they went. And it would turn out that they would go into the woods for these retreats where they would get away from technology in the city. When they were gone for a few days and no one had heard from them, no one thought twice about it. On top of this, Bobby and Sherilyn had informed Madison's school that they'd be pulling her out of class because they were going to be moving. So when Madison didn't show up for school, the school did not raise any alarms because they assumed she'd been pulled out of school. On October 16th, 2009, 8 days after the Jamesons had left their house to go scout out this property in Red Oak, a couple of hunters in the Panola Mountains, which is near Red Oak, found the Jamesons' truck parked on the side of the road. Now, these hunters are in the middle of nowhere, which means the truck is in the middle of nowhere. And so as they're walking over to it, they're expecting to see the owner of the truck. But as they get over to the truck, there is no owner anywhere. They called out a couple times to see if they could get this person's attention or whoever it was that owned it, and no one came over to them. They look in the truck and they see there is this very sick-looking dog sitting on the back seat. It would turn out it was the Jamesons' dog. It was Maisie. Now, the windows were up and the truck was locked, so the hunters called the police. Police show up, they break a window, and they get Maisie out of the truck. They give her food and water, and she would end up making a full recovery. They look in the vehicle and all of the Jamisons' personal effects are in there. Their phones, their wallets, their jackets, their clothes. Underneath the front seat was $32,000 of cash in a bank bag. Also, they found this weird letter written by Sherilyn to Bobby that was this 11-page hate letter that basically accused Bobby of being a hermit, which seems like a strange thing to ramble for 11 pages about, but either way. The police did an initial search of the area looking for the Jamison family, but they couldn't find them. And so the running theory was they must have pulled over and walked into the woods for some reason, got turned around, and they're just lost, and we need to go find them. The police were able to use the cell phones that had been left inside of the vehicle and were able to use their GPS locations and track where the phones had been before coming to rest inside of this vehicle. And they saw that the cell phones had actually gone up the trail a little ways. They had been up towards the top of the mountain for about 15 minutes before coming back down and then wound up in the truck where they were when they were found. So the police walk up the hill to where the GPS said they had been, and they find all these footprints that look to be Madison's because there's a child's footprint as well as probably Bobby's and Sherilyn's. But they're nowhere to be found, and there's no clue of where they went after being up there. When they started scanning through each of the cell phones to see if there was any information about where they might have gone, they found on Bobby's phone a picture of Madison that was taken up at that little location that the GPS took them. The picture of Madison has been hotly contested on the internet for a long time now. It's hard to tell in the image if Madison is happy or sad. It's also unclear based on her body language if her parents are taking the photo or if this was kind of staged by someone else. So between the GPS showing that they had been at the top of this mountain at one point, plus the picture of Madison confirming she had at least been up there, the police started this massive search with that section on the mountain where they had been standing as kind of the center point. And they searched all around the Panola Mountains. But after an extensive search of this new area, they didn't find anything. No new leads had come in, so ultimately the search was called off. 4 years later, in November of 2013, some hikers were in the Panola Mountains, about 5 kilometers, maybe a little bit less, from where the Jamison truck was found. And they come across skeletal remains of 3 individuals. It looked like 2 adults and a child. They were laying face down side by side, and it was clear that they were not complete skeletons, but there was enough there to know for sure that these are people. As soon as the police were called, everybody assumed this has to be the Jamison family. It would actually take almost a year before they were able to confirm that yes, those bones are in fact the Jamison family. While the Oklahoma medical examiner was not able to determine a cause of death because the remains were just partial, they didn't have enough to work with, they did see that there was a big hole in the back of Bobby's skull and there was other holes in some of the other bones that many people assumed were from bullets, but it was never determined if that actually was what it was from. As soon as it came out that it was the Jamison family's remains, the first prominent theory was that this had to have been a murder-suicide, where Sherilyn, who was mad at Bobby, she wrote that hate-filled 11-page letter that was found in the car. She's unstable from not taking her medication to combat her bipolar disorder. She seems like the person that would take her family out and then turn on herself. But all of her family said she would never harm her daughter. Maybe she would have harmed Bobby, but she never would have harmed her daughter. Also, why would you have brought your dog along and left your dog in the car and $32,000 of cash in the car? So that doesn't fit that scenario at all. The next theory was, well, maybe they just pulled over, walked into the woods for some reason, and then got lost and died of exposure. And that's still definitely a possible theory, except at the time they went missing, the temperatures were very mild. They were not dropping below freezing at night. It didn't rain very much, so it was kind of perfect conditions to be lost in the woods. It would have taken quite a while for them to die from exposure. And if you add in the fact that they were searching that area that they were found in pretty extensively within a few days of them going missing. If they had been lost and were only a few kilometers from the road, they would have been found in that search, but they weren't. The next theory that friends and family of the Jamison family predominantly believe is they were kidnapped. That maybe, they were driving on that road and someone flagged them down, whether it was someone they knew or someone that did not seem threatening, that caused them to get out of their car and come over to them, leaving their car the way it was with all of their belongings inside and with their dog inside, shut the door, they're not threatened. They walk over to this person or this group, and then something happens where they are either against their will or they're complicit, and they walk into the woods, never to go back to their truck, and then they ultimately pass away in the woods just a few kilometers away. However, none of those theories can account for the very bizarre video footage that they have of the Jameson family on the day they left their house to go check out the property in Red Oak. So on October 8th, 2009, the video shows Bobby and Cheryl Lynn making multiple trips, about 20 or more, from their house to their truck, where they're loading gear into their truck. But they appear to be almost in a trance, which is what the sheriff said when he first saw the video. They're walking back and forth and they're carrying their stuff into the truck, but periodically they're making trips without carrying anything. They're just walking to the truck with nothing in hand, looking at the truck, and then walking back to the house. And then they come back out and they have something in their hands, and then the next trip they have nothing. And periodically on their trek back and forth, they would just stop and just turn and look off into the distance, not interacting with each other. Bobby and Cheryl haven't spoken to each other at all. They're just doing this weird trance-like commute back and forth between truck and house before ultimately they load up the truck and they do leave. A lot of people speculated that, well, it looks like Bobby and Cheryl Lynn must have been using drugs. But when they first found the truck and they searched the Jameson's truck and they searched the Jameson family house, there was no traces of drugs anywhere, and their family said there's no history of drug abuse. There was also a theory that perhaps the Jameson family got tied up in a cult, and that was why they were moving and they were going to live this minimalist lifestyle, and they had brought cash to, give to this cult, but in fact they had actually been the target of the cult, and that was what led to their demise. Or maybe they were complicit and they wanted to sacrifice themselves or something, but no one really knows. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Siberian Cabin. When most people picture Russia in their minds, they picture European Russia, which is literally the part of Russia on the western side that sits in Europe and is by far the most populated part of the country. But European Russia only accounts for 23% of the total territory that is Russia. The other 77% is to the east of European Russia. It starts at the Ural mountain range and it extends all the way over 5 million square miles to the Pacific Ocean. And this vast, mostly forested expanse, which is 50 times bigger than the entire United Kingdom, is called Siberia. And Siberia is absolutely brutal. In Siberia, it is almost always freezing cold. Literally. The average annual temperature across all of Siberia is 32.9 degrees Fahrenheit. So it is 0.9 degrees above freezing on average every single day. In addition to the extremely deadly weather that exists basically year-round in Siberia, Siberia is also home to a bunch of huge deadly animals, such as the brown bear, which is the same as the infamous grizzly bear in North America, the gray wolf, which by size alone makes virtually all other wolves look like little puppies. Gray wolves can grow to be nearly 200 pounds. And of course, there is the highly intelligent Siberian tiger, who is perhaps one of the only predators on Earth that is known to seek out and kill people for revenge. For example, in 1997, a hunter named Vladimir Markov was walking through a Siberian forest when he came face to face with one of these Siberian tigers, and he ended up shooting the tiger before fleeing, except the tiger didn't die. Instead, it got up and secretly followed Vladimir all the way back to his cabin, and then this tiger camped out outside of the cabin until Vladimir came out again, and the tiger pounced, killed him, and ate him. And so unsurprisingly, Siberia has an absolutely minuscule population relative to its massive size. However, there are some adventurous people out there who are drawn to Siberia for the same reasons that most other people avoid it. These adventurous people see Siberia as one of the last truly wild places on our planet, and they want to experience it for themselves. And one of these highly adventurous people was a young man named Colin Madsen. Colin, who came from a very successful American family, was a big outdoors enthusiast who at some point in his youth began researching Siberia because he fell in love with its rugged natural beauty. He quickly began researching not only Siberia, but Siberian culture and Russian culture, and also at some point he became fluent in the Russian language. Then, in 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he left his home in Missouri and moved to Siberia. He settled in one of Siberia's few population centers, a city called Irkutsk, which is located in the southeast of Siberia and right along the edge of Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest freshwater lake. Colin's Siberia plan was twofold. He would go to school while he was there, and he would go out and explore. And at first, his plan went perfectly. He was accepted into Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, and very quickly he made friends who were eager to accompany him on his adventures out into the Siberian wilderness. From his arrival in Siberia in 2013 to 2016, Colin did well in his studies, and he spent countless hours exploring the forests and mountainous areas all around Lake Baikal and right outside of Irkutsk. In fact, Colin became so familiar with this region that he began volunteering with a nonprofit in the area that went around marking new trails, which meant Colin was literally venturing into the wilds of Siberia and just marking the trail as he went. So when Colin's family heard about what happened to him in 2016, they could not believe it. In March of 2016, Colin and 3 of his good hiking friends, one was American and 2 were Russian, decided they wanted to go on a hike together. They settled on hiking to the summit of Love Peak, which was a mountain located a few hours away from Irkutsk in a small village called Arshan. This hike was nothing compared to the gnarly Siberian wilderness hikes all 4 of these guys had been on before. The trail that led up to Love Peak, it was fairly steep, but it was incredibly well marked, and all 4 of these guys had hiked it several times before. However, because Colin and his friends were so experienced at hiking in Siberia, they knew that even the easiest hikes needed to be respected, because Siberia was still Siberia. There were dangers that lurked everywhere. And so the men called ahead to the village of Arshan, and they rented one of these small rustic cabins that's in the village that sits right at the base of Love Peak, and it's kind of tucked away in this forest. And so this cabin would serve as their sort of base camp and would allow them to arrive in Arshan, get their gear together, and then when they were ready, they could begin this hike to the summit. And so a few days later, on March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends loaded up their car and they drove west to Arshan. And when they got there, they stopped at a local store and got some supplies and then made their way to their cabin. Their cabin was just a single room with a few beds inside of it. It was enough to protect them from the elements, but really nothing more. As for a toilet, the cabin didn't have one, but there was an outhouse outside that they could use. So after the friends moved into the cabin and claimed their beds and put their things down, they all sat down and began prepping their gear and eating some food and chatting. And then finally, at 2 a.m., they decided they needed to go to sleep because their plan was to get on the path up to Love Peak by 7 a.m., which meant they needed to get up at 5 a.m. to make their final preparations. So at 2 a.m., the lights in the cabin turned off and the friends all fell asleep. And then 3 hours later at 5 a.m., when the lights came back on again, it was immediately clear something was wrong. Colin was not in his bed. His friends assumed when they looked over at his bed and saw his personal belongings were all still there, that Colin must have gotten up and headed outside, maybe to use the outhouse or go for a quick walk, and they just hadn't heard him leaving. And so the 3 friends initially just kind of shrugged off Colin's absence and said, he'll be back any minute, most likely. And if for some reason he's not back soon, he'll certainly be back by 7 a.m. because that was the agreed upon time they would leave for this hike. But as the minutes ticked closer and closer to 7 a.m. and Colin still had not shown up or tried to call them or do anything, the friends started to worry. It just didn't make any sense that Colin would just get up and leave without telling them where he was going. Finally, at 7 a.m., when Colin still had not shown up, and the friends' cursory search of the outside area near the cabin had yielded no results, they decided they had to tell someone. And so they wrote a note addressed to Colin, and they put it on the front of their cabin door. And this note basically just told Colin, if you come back here and you see this note, know that we're looking for you. So stay put or tell someone you're here. And so after putting up this note, the friends left the cabin and they headed to the nearest police station where they reported Colin missing. The police would eventually launch this huge search in and around Arshan, both in the forested area right around the village and then also up into the mountains near Love Peak. But despite this huge effort, no one could find Colin, at least not at first. On Monday, April 4th, so 8 days into Colin's disappearance, a group of searchers were looking in the forest about 1 mile away from the cabin where Colin and his friends had been staying. And they look up ahead and they see there is this clearing and there's something in the middle of it. And so the searchers begin moving their way towards this clearing, ducking under branches and stepping over brush. And when they get close enough, they can see Colin is in the clearing. And Colin is deceased. He was laying flat on his back with his left arm extended out to the side and his right arm extended but closer to his body, and both of his hands were clenched in tight fists. And on his hands and his wrists were visible abrasions and cuts, which later would be determined to have most likely been caused from someone or something holding onto him, trying to restrain Colin. Colin also had visible abrasions and cuts on the front of his neck. Colin's clothing, which consisted of a long-sleeve thermal shirt, heavy pants, and hiking boots, were ripped and torn in several places. And interestingly, Colin was not wearing socks under his boots. Now that seems inconsequential, but Colin had had surgery on both of his ankles and had scar tissue on his ankles that if he didn't have socks on, those scars would rub against the inside of his boot. And he said it was very painful. So he always wore socks. Also, Colin's body showed virtually no signs of decomposition, and all of his wounds and abrasions looked, quote, fresh, according to medical personnel. In short, Colin looked like he had recently been in some sort of physical altercation, and whoever or whatever he was grappling with had eventually overpowered him and killed him, although it was not clear how he actually died. Russian authorities were very quick to suspect Colin's 3 friends who had been with him, but they were brought into the station and they denied having anything to do with Colin's death, and they all passed their lie detector tests. After that, Russian authorities quickly closed this case by concluding that, well, if his friends didn't do it, then that means Colin must have been high on drugs or drinking alcohol or both, and he just wandered out of his cabin and he got lost in the woods and he died of hypothermia. He froze to death. The end. However, Colin's parents just could not accept that as being what happened to their son. There were a lot of reasons for skepticism, but the main one was that Colin was an absolute expert at navigating this particular region of Siberia. And so the idea that he would leave his cabin for a quick walk or something and get so completely lost that he would die 8 days later seemed way too far-fetched. And so Colin's parents hired a US-based private lab to do a review of Russia's autopsy of Colin to give their opinion if the autopsy was accurate or not. And this US-based lab pretty much immediately found that the Russian autopsy was not remotely accurate. Number 1, Colin was not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. He was sober. Although technically he did have very small amounts of THC in his urine. THC is the chemical that is found in marijuana, but the amount was so little, it basically meant he had consumed the THC days before he went missing. And so he would not have been remotely affected by that small amount of THC in his system. Number 2, the lab determined that Colin almost certainly did not die from hypothermia. Instead, all signs pointed to Colin dying from being suffocated, meaning he was murdered. Someone crushed his airway or in some way restricted him from breathing, and that's what killed him. And 3, based on the lack of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries on Colin's body, and the lack of animal predation on his body when they found him, indicated that Colin did not just wander out of his cabin and immediately die somewhere in the forest. Instead, he was alive for most of the time people were looking for him. Meaning when they found him, he likely had died within hours of being found. And so these findings by this US-based lab kind of create a general theory about what must have happened to Colin. After Colin left the cabin in the early morning hours of March 28th, maybe to go to the outhouse or to go for a quick walk, when he went outside, someone or something was nearby, and they either lured Colin to them or they straight up ambushed Colin and took him away. Now, we have no idea what happened to Colin after he was abducted, but we can safely assume that after being abducted and taken somewhere, he was alive, and he stayed alive for several days until on the 8th day of his disappearance, Colin was killed, likely by his captor, either at the spot where he was found, or he was killed somewhere else, maybe in the forest, and then moved to the spot where he was found. Many people believe it was the Russian government who targeted Colin, they kidnapped him, and they killed him. And their botched investigation into his death was actually a calculated cover-up. Colin had participated in at least one peaceful environmentalist-led protest in Siberia, and after the protest, Colin apparently got a written warning by the Russian police not to attend another protest. But why would Colin, who was just one of many people involved in these protests, be singled out by the Russian government and killed for his participation? And why would the government elect to kill Colin when he was with 3 of his closest friends who would immediately notice his absence? It just doesn't add up. Today, Colin's parents are still trying to figure out what happened to their son, but unfortunately, their son's case is closed in Russia, and so no one on the Russian side is talking to the parents or giving them any new information. And so as a result, they and the rest of us are left to wonder who or what was lurking in the shadows when Colin stepped out of the cabin that morning. And then where did they take him, and what did they do to him for nearly a week before they killed him deep inside of that Siberian forest?
Of my own lies, empty days, silent cries. I lied to you, fell apart. Now I'm lost in a broken heart. Shadows linger every night. Pain's a singer, no end in sight. I lied to you.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time.